Winter 1947 turns to the spring of 1948, and the tide in the Chinese Civil War is turning fast. As Mao Zedong's forces encircle and crush entire nationalist armies, Chiang Kai-Shek's hopes of victory collapse. On the home front, inflation soars, and faith in his regime begins to unravel. So, just how long can Chiang hold out before everything falls apart? I'm Indy Neidell. Welcome to episode 3 of the Chinese Civil War, part of our series War to War, where we follow the wars that wouldn't end within a Cold World War, the beginning of the digital age, the atomic age, and the space age, when we began to replicate our minds electronically, gained the power to end our very existence as a species, and discovered we can truly reach for the stars. In episode 2, we saw that the tide had turned firmly in favor of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. In Manchuria, they captured cities and surrounded enemy armies. South of the Great Wall, they also advanced. All the while, the communists strengthened their hold over the peasantry with a combination of violence and land reform. And now, communist leader Mao Zedong launches 3 massive offensives that will bring him within grasp of victory. So sit down, get comfy, make yourself a drink, because this will be a long one. Okay, in April 1948, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin is still trying to convince Mao that his best hopes rest in signing some sort of compromise peace agreement with Chiang Kai-Shek, leader of the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, or KMT. If this seems a bit strange, well, I covered Stalin's logic in the previous episodes, but the gist of it is that Stalin not only has a pessimistic view of Mao's military strength, but he also favors a weak China split between nationalists and communists rather than a strong China united under Mao. Still, Mao is certain that the war will now go only in his favor and orders his commanders to undertake the total destruction of the nationalists. The first step is to fully win Manchuria. By this point, though, pretty much all outside observers agree that the nationalist position here is doomed. The Americans suggest that Chiang withdraw from the region to set up a line of defense somewhere south of the Great Wall to preserve as much as possible of what we might call China proper, in other words, China without Manchuria. But Chiang is determined to hold on. Chiang thus lost his last chance to save what was left of the armies he had committed to the takeover of Manchuria. By mid-1948, the power balance there had shifted irreversibly against him. The communists now claimed to have 700,000 regular troops in the region, plus 330,000 local or second-line forces, and 1.6 million civilian support workers. The government's increasingly demoralized troops numbered only about 450,000 with no effective second-line replacements. Mao will soon give the order to finish off the nationalists in Manchuria. But first, the communists wrap up some unfinished business elsewhere. The East China Field Army finally takes almost all of Shandong province by mid-1948, leaving the government in control of just a few isolated strongpoints. Over the coming months, the communists also take much of southern Shaanxi, including the cities of Luoyang and Linfen. A few months later, Mao's forces lay siege to the provincial capital Jinan, which they captured towards the end of September, although Chiang does retain control of the port of Qingdao, for now at least. Against all American advice, Chiang refuses to evacuate his troops from Jinan until it is far too late. And in the end, the nationalist soldiers garrisoned there are so demoralized that most of them simply defect or surrender without much of a fight. By the time Jinan falls, the communists have linked up their territory in the provinces of Shaanxi, Chahar, Hubei, Shandong, and Henan into one block. And Mao declares a unified North China People's Government in August 1948 with its capital at Shijiazhuang. With that done, Lin Biao launches his 8th offensive in Manchuria in September. This is the Liaoshen campaign, named after the Manchurian province of Liaoning and its capital city, Shenyang. The communists have already been applying a lot of pressure to Shenyang and Changchun and are close to completely cutting them off from the outside world. In order to do so, Lin goes after the air and rail transport hub at Jinzhou, which the nationalists have been using to supply the 2 larger cities. On September 12th, he launches his attack, catching the government forces by surprise and isolating Jinzhou within about 2 weeks. Communist artillery proves highly effective, and they soon have the Nationalist airfield locked down, starving the defenders of food and ammunition. Then, the Red Army breaks through the outer defenses and fights its way through, street by street, house by house, until they force the Nationalists to surrender October 16th. 500 kilometers to the northeast, Lin has ordered his commanders to turn the besieged city of Changchun into a city of death, right? Over the summer, civilians survive on insects, grass, and even resort to cannibalism. By autumn, they've stripped the city for firewood. Those who try to leave have their valuables, gold, silver, cooking pots, salt, confiscated by Nationalist sentries. They then become Roman deserters, hoping to reach the communist lines. But Lin's troops fire on them, and when they turn back, the Nationalists refuse re-entry. Tens of thousands of people are left to die in the no man's land between the two armies. With no hope left, Chiang orders General Zhang Dongguo to attempt a breakout to Shenyang October 16th. But Zhang's position collapses when his 60th Army refuses to leave, turns its gun on his 7th Army, and surrenders the city to the communists. Mao accepts all defectors into the Red Army, allowing officers to keep their ranks. Total casualties are somewhere in the region of 150,000 to 250,000, including perhaps 150,000 civilians who die of starvation. The scale of death here at Changchun will remain mostly hidden for over half a century. Breaking the timeline a bit here, but in 1989, a book will be published called White Snow, Red Blood, in which a communist colonel named Zhang Zhenglong compares the scale of death at Changchun to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. He also reveals that, as well as death from starvation, the communist forces deliberately massacred thousands of civilians after the siege. Zhang's book will be suppressed, but all the censorship in the world cannot hide the grim truth that lies buried beneath the earth. When workers in Changchun started digging trenches for a new irrigation system in the summer of 2006, they made a gruesome discovery. The rich black soil was clogged with human remains. Below a meter of earth were thousands of skeletons closely packed together. When they dug deeper, the workers found several more layers of bones, stacked up like firewood. A crowd of local residents gathered around the excavated area was taken aback by the sheer size of the burial site. Some thought that the bodies belonged to victims of the Japanese occupation during the Second World War. Nobody, except an elderly man, realized they had just stumbled on remnants of the Civil War. Lin's next target is Shenyang. Here, the pre-war population of 1.2 million has swelled to 4 million thanks to a refugee influx, and conditions are nearly as bad as in Changchun. Chiang Kai-Shek's own orders have crippled the city's defenses. In early October, he sent about half of the 200,000 strong garrison in a failed attempt to reach the besieged troops in Jinzhou. As these troops tried to return, they were ambushed and largely destroyed by Lin Biao. That means that Lin's 300,000 troops faced just 100,000 or so nationalist defenders at Shenyang. In the end, panic grips the streets. Fights erupt over seats on trains and planes heading south, and law and order breaks down. Then the communists enter the city, and Shenyang surrenders on November 2nd after only token resistance. With that, the Battle of Manchuria is over. Lin Biao's Liaoshen campaign has been a remarkable success. Chiang's Manchurian force of 450,000 troops has been reduced to just 1/3 of its size through casualties and desertion, with those 150,000 escaping south of the wall. Mao now controls Manchuria with its huge industrial potential, fertile land, and vast pool of potential recruits. It is Mao Zedong who has won the first great victory of the Chinese Civil War. Before moving to the next campaign, it's worth stepping away from the battlefield. By late 1948, Chiang isn't just losing the war, he's also losing on the home front. Chiang is elected as president of the Republic by the National Assembly in April 48, and one of his first big decisions is to try and get a grip on the hyperinflation that has been impoverishing the Chinese people since the early 1940s. The situation is now so bad that Chinese paper mills actually make a profit by pulping the worthless banknotes. In July 1948, Chiang gets together with one of his economic advisors, TV Soong, to discuss a plan of action. Soong is not just any old advisor, by the way. He's also one of Chiang's brothers-in-law and one of the most influential people in the government. He spent much of World War II lobbying for American support in Washington. The KMT government decides to scrap the old currency, the Fabi, and launch a new currency called the gold yuan in August 1948 at a staggering exchange rate of 3 million to 1. But public trust in the new currency is low. The government hopes a major American stabilization loan will help, but Washington is growing skeptical of backing Chiang. Some of Chiang's advisors also point out, with the budget deficit at revenue equaling just 34% of spending, there's really no point reforming the currency without reining in spending. But this doesn't happen at all. Instead, the burden is passed on to ordinary people. Using emergency powers, Chiang freezes wages and prices, bans strikes and protests. He also demands that citizens surrender any gold, silver, or foreign currency in exchange for the new yuan. This raises about $170 million US dollars, but is deeply unpopular and hits China very much unequally. The wealthiest people with overseas assets in Hong Kong, the US, Switzerland, they are largely unaffected. Ultimately, the reform collapses as people simply expect the yuan to follow the Fabi into worthlessness. The rich hoard gold, dollars, other valuable goods and commodities, and by October 1948, the new currency has plunged in value even faster than the old one. Shops and restaurants are closing, prices are skyrocketing, and medical supplies are unobtainable. Chiang's son, Changchun, tries to enforce the policy with an iron fist in Shanghai. But even there, the reform is doomed to failure. In Shanghai, Chiang mobilized criticism against hoarders and speculators, ordered the arrest and occasional execution of delinquents, and raided warehouses and suspects' homes, all to urge public compliance. But despite this moralistic dedication and the strenuous attempts at enforcement, the gold yuan plan failed. Shanghai was, in any case, not isolated from the rest of China, and the more successful Changchun was, the greater the pressure on Shanghai businesses to sell their goods elsewhere, where prices were continuing to rise. Accordingly, the city began to experience a desperate shortage of both food and manufactured goods, nor did the government hold firm to its plan. When it imposed heavy new taxes on sales of certain consumer goods, such as tobacco, shopkeepers simply closed their doors until they won permission to raise their prices. By now, Chiang Kai-Shek is also dealing with a pretty significant grassroots movement that blames the nationalist government for the war and demands peace at almost any cost. This view, that Chiang and his government are to blame for the war, is pretty widely held in nationalist areas. Essentially, it holds that Chiang and the KMT brought this war on themselves thanks to their corruption, failure to reform, and their unwillingness to reach a reasonable compromise with the communists. The communists had won the balance of popular opinion during the peace negotiations of 1945 and 6. There was a general belief that they had been sincere, for example, at the Political Consultative Conference in January 46, when they agreed to several compromises aimed at avoiding all-out war. The government lost credibility in this contest when the KMT Central Executive Committee unilaterally broke a number of conference agreements a few weeks later. Finally, the most important reason for directing anti-war sentiment primarily against the government was the general assumption that the strength of the CCP was being built upon the shortcomings of the KMT. The government was held responsible for not having remedied its defects during 20 years in power. Since 1945, there have been 4 major waves of student protest here, largely backed by faculty and public intellectuals. The students demand peace, an end to U.S. support for the KMT, and a shift in spending from the military to civilian needs, especially education. While there are some student groups who support the government and receive KMT funding, the most talented leaders from the top universities are firmly anti-war. The government either fails to grasp or refuses to acknowledge how deeply student sentiment, not to mention that of much of the general public, has turned against it. The KMT seems to think that by cutting off the head of the movement, sometimes quite literally, the rest will fall. Government decision makers remain constricted by their belief that if only the very few real communist agitators among the students could be eliminated, their movement could be controlled. The consequent harsh tactics in turn further alienated the students. Their leaders, particularly officials of the university's self-governing associations, were the chief targets of beatings, arrests, and abduction by an assortment of law enforcement personnel. On the basis of tip-offs by informers, the arrest of student activists became a common occurrence. Blacklists of activists and suspected underground communists were drawn up. Students arrested or abducted often simply disappeared. Execution was the anticipated punishment for genuine communist agents if their identity could be ascertained. Torture was also a common means of extracting information. The student protest movement has swelled from the arrival of tens or even hundreds of thousands of student refugees from communist-occupied areas. In Beijing, some 5,000 Manchurian student refugees have been left to starve on meager subsistence allowances, with many reduced to poverty, homelessness, begging, and petty crime. Seeing their futures vanishing before them, they decide to march on the Beijing Municipal Council in July 1948. Chiang's forces open fire on them from armored cars, killing 14 students and wounding over 100. All the failings of the nationalists that we've covered so far today and in the early episodes are causing a serious strain on Chiang's legitimacy. Meanwhile, Mao is getting ready to strike once more. Attention now turns to central and eastern China. As I mentioned earlier, Chiang lost Jinan, capital of Shandong province, in September 1948. He's arguably more concerned about this than the defeats in Manchuria. Apparently, Chinese strategists say Manchuria is a limb of the nation. The central provinces are the heart. Chiang is desperate to stop the communists reaching the Yangtze River, which would put Nanjing and Shanghai at risk. After Jinan falls then, Chiang orders the 6th and 7th armies to retreat to Chuzhou in Jiangsu province. The city lies at the junction of the Tianjin, Pukou, and Longhai railways, connecting it to major cities like Nanjing, Beijing, Tianjin, and Shanghai. Chiang thinks the hills to the north will slow down the communists, while flat ground to the south will ease his own logistics. He also believes the communists will need months to assemble their forces, but Chiang could not be more wrong. Mao moves quickly and orders General Su Yu to destroy the 6th and 7th armies before they can entrench around Chuzhou. Mao's urgency was explained by his understanding, which paralleled Chiang's, that the war had reached a critical stage. He grasped the momentous consequences that would ensue if the nationalists, following their loss of Manchuria, could be dealt a further decisive blow in central China. It would leave them without a realistic hope of recovery. In arguably the most perceptive military judgment he was ever to take, Mao saw in the Huaihai campaign the chance to build the war to a rapid and successful conclusion. It would justify his earlier decision to abandon attrition and embark on a war of total annihilation of the nationalists. The Huaihai campaign, named for operational boundaries of the Huai River and the Longhai Railway, will be the largest of the Civil War, with both sides fielding more than 1 million men each. On the communist side, the Red Army has now been renamed the People's Liberation Army, the PLA. Mao has Su Yu's East China Field Army and Liu Bosheng's Central Plains Field Army. Chen Yi and Deng Xiaoping serve as political commissars to both armies, respectively. Mao gives the order to enlist all captured nationalist prisoners from Jinan into the PLA, overruling generals who think that's too risky. On the nationalist side, we have the 6th Army under Li Yanian, the 7th under Huang Baitao, and the Chuzhou garrison under Du Yuming. Liu Ji has overall command on the ground, although Chiang Kai-Shek is personally overseeing operations here. Su Yu has impressed Mao over the course of the war, and the whole plan is very much Su's brainchild. Su launches his attack on November 6th as Huang's nationalist 7th Army tries to withdraw over the Grand Canal, which runs in front of Chuzhou. Once again, Su is helped by leaks from the nationalist camp, which inform him that Huang's army is running behind schedule and has not secured all the bridgeheads. Soon, he surrounds the 7th Army at the Battle of Nianzhuan. The PLA pounds the 7th with artillery for almost 2 weeks. The Nationalists fight well, though, and inflict serious casualties, but they are cut off from supplies, and they are annihilated. Once again, old rivalries undermine the war effort. Huang Baitao committed suicide. His army's defeat and his own tragic end might have been avoided had he received help from the newly formed 2nd NRA Army at Bengbu. However, although it had been in a position to assist, the 2nd Army had made no move. This was because its commander, Xu Xingquan, nursed a grievance against Huang and so refused to commit his forces to a genuine relief effort. It was yet another of those feuds that so often undermined NRA effectiveness. In the second phase, the Nationalist 12th Army under Huang Wei attempts to move in from Henan to provide support, but the PLA's Central Plains Field Army, along with communist guerrillas, manages to surround them. On December 9th, Chiang orders part of the Chuzhou garrison, which still numbers some 300,000, to attempt a relief. But that force is encircled and wiped out. By mid-December, Huang Wei's army has been destroyed. A U.S. diplomat flies over the battlefield and observes the fighting. The huge enveloping movement was broken up into literally hundreds, maybe thousands of smaller pincer movements, each one moving in, pinching off one group of nationalist troops after another. It was magnificent. It was fascinating. At the same time, it was horrible, and when it was over, there was no nationalist army left. In the final phase, PLA forces besieged the remaining nationalists in and around Chuzhou. Now, despite their advantage in armor and artillery, which does inflict heavy casualties, the nationalists cannot bring their air power to bear because of snowy weather and earlier losses in the Laoshan campaign. Relief efforts from outside and breakout attempts fail. Running low on food and ammunition, the defenders are overrun by Chen Yi and Liu Bosheng and surrender on January 10th. Chiang Kai-Shek and his commanders had no one but themselves to blame for their defeat at Huaihai. The battle marked not just the end of effective government resistance in mainland China, but the culmination of years of military errors and mismanagement, defects that have become characteristic of nationalist military operations. Chiang himself is credited with having made the decision to fight on the Chuzhou Plain instead of withdrawing as advised to the natural barrier of the Huai River. Finally, Chiang Kai-Shek personally interfered with battle plans and issued operational orders while the fighting was in progress, as was his custom. Throughout the war, nationalist generals failed to capitalize on their advantage in numbers and equipment. What use are tanks, artillery, and aircraft if they can't be used in concert? Time and again, they retreat behind city walls only to be encircled and starved out. When they venture beyond, they move in slow columns that guerrillas can easily tear apart. PLA commanders, by contrast, have learned and adapted. They now coordinate both large-scale operations and guerrilla tactics. With the fall of Chuzhou, the Nationalists lose 200,000 troops, contributing to over 500,000 total losses in the Huaihai campaign. Among them are some of Chiang's best trained and best equipped forces. Huge amounts of American-supplied arms are now in communist hands. You know what? At least 300 of these 500,000 personnel losses are prisoners or defectors. There's an interesting note about this in Sarah Payne's book, The Wars for Asia, which really shows that these defections are very much a sign that the wind in China has changed irreversibly. Unlike in the West, where defections of entire armies are rare, they are common in Chinese history. The Ming Dynasty army became the Green Standard Army of the Qing Dynasty. During the fall of a dynasty, numerous armies changed sides to work in the service of the rising new dynasty. The desertion of the old order for the new reflects a belief in the dynastic cycle and the immutable force of nature. Loyalties change in a tidal wave when it becomes clear to the many that the mandate of heaven has shifted from the collapsing old order to the ascendant new one. On the strategic level, the PLA now control northern and central China, and the door is open to the south and the nationalist capital in Nanjing and to Shanghai. But before that, there is something that Mao wants to get out of the way. Now, I said at the start that there were 3 massive offensives in this period. Well, I'm afraid you're going to have to wait until next time for me to cover the 3rd. But here's a little preview. By January 1949, Mao's troops are closing in on a very symbolic prize, an ancient city which for more than 3,000 years has been China's northern capital, the seat of power for the Ming and Qing dynasties and for Sun Yat-sen's republic. Where better for Mao to proclaim his new People's Republic than the city of Beijing? It is thanks to the TimeGhost Army that we can produce this series and everything else we do on this channel, the World War II channel, the Korean War channel, all of our channels. And you too can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Walter Goodwater is the TimeGhost Army Member of the Week. If you want to have a look at how another communist leader is reshaping his country, you can click here for a special on the origins of the Vietnam War. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.